So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Top Tens. I'm your interim host Karl, and today we're talking about 10 animals that were put on trial for their crimes. And as with all the videos here on Top Tens, this one is based on an original article submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That member today being Ed Hatchett, who you can follow at the social media links below if you are so inclined. My social media links are also down there, as are all those lovely bells and whistles. The people behind the scenes have asked me to ask you on YouTube to press like the like button and the little bell so you can get notifications when we go live. You can also feel free to comment with feedback or suggestions for other videos and subscribe for more like this. Normally, I'd like to say this at the end of the video, but just analytics say the earlier I say it, the more likely all three are to happen. But let's get to it. Wait, but no, we're talking about animals today. Where's Snoop? Yeah, an anteater, let's go. This is my stuffed anteater. It's called Snoop. I like it, it's fun. We've already covered a few animal trials here on Top Tens before, but there are many, many more cases worth mentioning. Far from being an oddity, trying animals for crimes was a solemn and oddly frequent affair, especially in medieval Europe. And in addition to being quite humorous to look back at, it was also quite legally important for setting precedent, that precedent being that everything was under control, the control of the government. And of course, punishing theft, whatever the species, helped prop up the notion of property. And charges range from case to case, but they all had one thing in common, that being that they were, in some cases quite literally, batshit insane. In ascending order of lunacy, here are 10 of the worst offenders, listed by the species that was on the dock. Number 10, monkeys. When, during the Napoleonic Wars, some English found a monkey on a beach, they were immediately suspicious. Its appearance followed the wreckage of a French ship nearby, and this was the only survivor, washed upon shore on debris, soaked through and looking altogether miserable. Having never seen a Frenchman, only the propagandist caricatures with claws and tails, they took this monkey to be a Frenchman. It also didn't help that as the French ship's mascot, the monkey was dressed like a human sailor. And after a hasty trial right there on the beach, they found it guilty of espionage, sentenced it to death, and hanged it from the mast of a fishing boat. This was admittedly extrajudicial mob law, unlike the other items on this list, but unfortunately it wasn't uncommon. Although frowned upon, people often took the law into their own hands when it came to punishing animals. And apparently that law also applied at sea. And disturbingly in this case, there may be more to this story, and according to one quite convincing theory, it wasn't actually a monkey that they hanged, but a child employed as what was known as a powder monkey, basically the person they had priming the cannons with gunpowder. Whatever the case, the people of Hartlepool are still known as monkey hangers today. And that's a word I really don't like saying. I don't like that term. And apparently the people of Hartlepool don't mind it because they've come to embrace the name. In fact, their football team's mascot is a monkey called Hangus. And in 2002, a mayoral candidate dressed as the monkey promised to give free bananas to children, and they won. Number 9, termites. When the Portuguese invaded Brazil, they took their insanity with them, embarrassing themselves in front of the natives by charging some termites with vandalism. Ironically, the plaintiffs were Franciscan friars, that is, followers of a man who 5 centuries earlier preached on sharing and kinship with all of God's creatures. Still, they sought to excommunicate the termites for eating their food and furniture. Naughty termites. It was actually the defense lawyer that mostly resembled the original St. Francis, arguing that the termites had, like all of God's creatures, a clear right to sustenance. He even claimed that the industriousness displayed by the termites put the idle Grey Friars to shame. Besides, he said, the termites were on the land first. In January 1713, the trial finally ended with a compromise. The cloister of friars will set up a reservation where the termites could live undisturbed. The decision was announced to the termite mounds, and they said, and I quote, "No sooner was the order of the proleptic judge promulgated." I don't know if I can get through this. No sooner was the order of the proleptic judge promulgated. Okay, one more. No sooner was the order of the proleptic judge promulgated than read officially before the hillers that the termites, they all came out and marched in columns to the place assigned. Naturally, this was interpreted as proof of their submission to God. Termites don't care. Moving on. Number 8, Weevils. After ravaging some vineyards in a hamlet in France, Weevils were personas non gratas. They had a good lawyer though. The trial concluded in the spring of 1546 with the judge ordering locals to beg for mercy from God, who, being the supreme author of all that exists, had created the earth and all of its creatures, including the Weevils. The hamlet also held 3 masses in, and I quote, solemn procession with songs and supplications round the vineyards, and it seemed to have worked for a time. The Weevils and Weevil God were appeased. But 40 years later, the Weevils returned and were put on trial once again. The second case, brought before the Prince Bishop of Marine, the Reverend Lord, his Vicar General and official, and recorded on 29 folio with a very long title in Latin I'm not going to say, lasted for several months. Again, it was argued that the people were guilty for incurring God's wrath, since the Weevils had the right to eat the plants. It was basically what they were created to do. The defense even pointed out that it was absurd and unreasonable to apply human laws to insects. But the counsel for the plaintiffs, on the other hand, the local vine growers, claimed that the Weevils were subject to man. The case was adjourned repeatedly while each side considered the case. Eventually, the Weevils' legal team countered that even if they were subject to man, that doesn't give us the right to punish them, especially with excommunication. That was the sole right of God. 2.5 months after the trial began, the people were ordered to set aside some land for the Weevils, fenced off so they could live in peace and harmony. But it didn't work, and 1 month later, the case was back in court. The plaintiffs begged the judge to order the Weevils to return to their enclosure under the threat of excommunication. Meanwhile, the defense team said that the enclosure was too barren with not enough food for the Weevils. Again, the case was adjourned numerous times, and it wasn't for another month and a half that a verdict was finally reached. What it was, however, we'll never know, because the final page of the court records was, and we're not making this up, eaten by Weevils. Are you old enough, Snoot? Great. Number 7. Cows. Because of their size, weight and temper, cows were frequently charged with attacks. In 1314, for instance, a bull escaped from a farm in France and gored a man to death. Then it was captured by the Count of Valois' men, imprisoned and sentenced to hang. But since the Count had no jurisdiction in Moisy, the sentence was overturned. Sadly, the bull at this point had already been killed. There are numerous other examples of murderous cows being hanged. However, given the value of cows and bulls, they, like horses, were typically confiscated instead. For example, in 12th century Burgundy, it was actually written into law that, and I quote, if an ox or a horse commits one or several homicides, it shall not be condemned to death, but shall be taken by the feudal lord within whose jurisdiction the deed was perpetrated. And that lord would then sell it and keep the profits, but, and the law continued, and I really don't like having to say this, but it is a direct quote from that law, if other beasts or Jews do it, the law continued, they shall be hanged by the hind feet. History sucks sometimes. It sucks so hard. As a rule, executed animals, even the organic grass-fed cows of the pre-industrial world, were never eaten as meat, because once an animal had become the peer of man in blood guiltiness and in judicial punishment, it was felt that eating it would basically be cannibalism. So they'd usually get buried with human criminals. But there were a couple of exceptions to this. For example, a cow killed in Ghent in Belgium in 1578 had its flesh sold to a local butcher in order to compensate its victims. But the head was then put on a spike and displayed near the gallows as a warning to all those other cows. Like, just don't knock people over. Number 6, dogs. Dogs, for the most part throughout history, were treated differently to livestock. They're already pretty much considered to be people. And by people, I mean they were treated like women and serfs. Again, history sucks. It sucks so hard. And they were even including something called the weregild, insurance payable by their killers to their owners. And in old Germanic law, dogs, as well as cats and cockerels, could even be witnesses in court if, for example, they were the only ones present when their owner's house was burglarized. In this case, the homeowner would bring their dog to court along with 3 straws from the roof thatch to symbolize the house. And here's me thinking, like, you know, chickens in Skyrim reporting your crimes to the police was unrealistic. Having sex with dogs, however, was to Christian sensibilities, and again, I have to remind people, history sucks. was as bad as having sex with a Jew. In fact, when a Parisian man was burned alive for coition with a Jewess, or sodomy, the court said it was precisely the same as if the man had copulated with a dog. Naturally, the woman was burned alive too. And examples are many, but one in particular sticks out from 1606, when a man was sentenced to hang for sodomizing a dog, but he ran away before they could do it. So, while the authorities killed the dog with a knock on the head, they hanged a portrait of the rapist alongside it. But dogs weren't always sentenced to death. Sometimes they were just simply imprisoned. This was the case in 1712, when a drummer's dog bit a councillor on the leg, and instead of execution, the dog was simply sentenced to 1 year imprisonment in the Narrow-Colton-Gine, an iron cage over the marketplace. Woof woof indeed. Number 5, donkeys. So just like humans, animals are entitled to appeals. One donkey sentenced to hang, for example, was saved by appeal to a higher court, and her sentence was commuted to a knock on the head. When it comes to stuff like this, I'm reminded of like that Simpsons joke that I think should be a real thing in law, where it's like when Homer gets falsely imprisoned, and they joke that, well, you serve some time in prison, so you can either like just go steal a car or kick me in the crotch. Like you get permission to commit a crime for free, and just Homer just kicks the guy in the crotch. Like they should do that. If you get falsely arrested or like harassed by the police, you should get permission to commit one crime.
No one ever chooses the car.
Appeals could even lead to acquittal for donkeys, and in 1750 a donkey was condemned for seducing her rapist, and the donkey was acquitted when the Van Veres parish priest delivered a certificate attesting to the donkey's good character. He and other parishioners of good standing, it read, were willing to bear witness that she is in word and deed and in all her habits of life a most honest creature. So a lot went on in those two sentences, but just because I had to read it multiple times in the initial script read-through, a donkey was f***ed. And then people came to the donkey's aid and like, don't punish the donkey. It's not the donkey's fault. The donkey's a good donkey. It's the dude who did the deed that you should be punishing, not the donkey. Speaking of donkeys, another donkey, or mule rather, was not so popular. By a man, it was sentenced to burn at Montpellier in 1565. Worse, because it was a vicious and inclined to kick, the executioner took it upon himself to cut off the donkey's feet before burning it. It's awful and it's cruel, but it's that extra step that makes, do you know that thing of like, it goes so far beyond like just horribleness that it starts to become funny. Like the donkey was killed, they cut its feet off. No, probably didn't serve the donkey any much, but that executioner was very much scolded because extrajudicial mutilation was not something they liked to add to sentences. Moving on, number 4, rats. Good old ratus, even as recently as the 19th century, were served a writ of ejection or letter of advice to induce them to quit any house. And because there was a good chance the rats wouldn't read such a writ, it was often like the case that they'd rub the order in grease to attract the attention of the rats. History, it sucks sometimes, but sometimes you get moments like just people rubbing grease on paper and giving it to a little rat. And in my head, like the little rat's got some little rat glasses on. One such letter from Maine even expressed sympathy for the rats, advising them to leave 1 Seaview Street for 6 Incubator Street, where they could live in a cellar full of vegetables or a barn full of grain. It finished by advising the rats that if they didn't leave the property by the date suggested, they'd be killed off with poison. Centuries earlier, in the 1500s, rats were summoned to court for eating all the barley in Autun, a French province. The courts knew that the rats wouldn't come and planned to punish the rodents accordingly. However, as their defense lawyer pointed out, there were way too many rats in the province for a single summons to suffice. It could never be seen by all of the rats, after all. The judge reluctantly agreed on the side of the rats and ordered a second summons, and I quote, to be published from the pulpits of all the parishes in the province. Then, when the rats still failed to arrive in court, their defense lawyer, again, the ratty defense lawyer, once again argued that the cats en route made the journey too dangerous for the rats. This meant that they had, and I quote, the right to appeal and could refuse to obey the writ. Let's just give props to the guy who's like, I'm going to defend the rats. Number 3. Caterpillars. In 1659, 5 Italian communes brought a complaint against some caterpillars for devastating their crops. The summons were nailed to trees in the forest, and while they didn't show up for the trial, the caterpillars were conceded in court to have the same right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness as any man, as long as theirs didn't infringe on the latter's. Talking of charismatic insects, even bees were put on trial in 864. The Council of Worms, i.e. the Rhineland city, not the species, sentenced a hive of bees to be suffocated for stinging a human to death. This was to be done as soon as possible before it could produce any honey, which on account of the murder would be demonically tainted and unfit for Christian consumption. Again, the thing is though, that's like a firing squad mentality right there. Like, people maybe don't know this, like the idea behind a firing squad is not every person in the line of a firing squad has a gun that works. Like, a lot of the people in the line are given blanks, and that's to give everyone there like the plausible deniability that they didn't fire the killing shot. And by that same token, like, you can't really prosecute anyone in that line for the murder because no one really knows that they did it. Is it like a similar thing for the bees? How do you know which bee did the killing? You can't put the entire hive on trial for something that only one bee did. Leave the bees alone. Speaking of leave them alone, number 2, some slugs. For devastating crops in 1487, the slugs of Autun were generously forewarned by 3 days of public processions, during which they were ordered to leave under penalty of being accursed. And what I'm noticing there as well, we've said that town name already. Why is it with the French and suing like random creatures for, like, you know, just the crops sucking ass? And as crazy as that sounds, the same thing happened the following year at Beju. Slugs were warned 3 times if they didn't get out of the province, they would be excommunicated. Whether slugs even consider themselves to be members of the church was irrelevant. The purpose of the excommunication was to make them fair game to kill, because as we've mentioned several times throughout this video, like, animals were considered to be under the domain of God, so excommunicating them basically meant that they no longer had the protection of the Lord and therefore could be killed with impunity. When even snails ended up being prosecuted in 1487, in 1500, in 1543 and in 1596, all in France. And we don't exactly know how or why these snails were punished. We just know that there were court records on the books of snails being sued. And finally, number 1, pigs. So pigs are among the most commonly prosecuted animals from history. One reason for this is the way they just roamed around towns unattended, munching on whatever they found, including consecrated wafers and sometimes children. There are numerous examples of the latter for which the pigs were usually hanged. For example, in 1567, a sow with a black snout was hanged from a tree for devouring a 4-month-old child's head, left hand and upper chest. In another case, the plaintiff made a special point of the fact that the pig had killed and ate a child even though it was a Friday, which, because it violated the Catholic prescription of meat, was a seriously aggravating factor. Sometimes the punishment was more an eye for an eye, and in 1386 a pig that tore the face and arms off a child was sentenced to hang after being mangled and maimed in the exact same way. It was even dressed as a man for the occasion. Another particularly grisly punishment for pigs was being buried alive. More popular, however, was simply burning the pigs alive, although in some cases judges were merciful and ordered that the pigs only be lightly singed before being strangled to death and having their corpses thrown upon the fire. just lightly singed, just a little bit. Just a little bit of crispy bacon. And like dogs and cows and other animals on this list, pigs were often jailed before they were executed, sometimes for weeks on end, and in some cases years in the same jails as people. Like, what are you in for? Oink. Same. So I hope everybody out there found this video to be educational, entertaining and informative. I certainly found the script to be all 3 of those things. And if you would like to give the author kudos for their good work, Ed Hatchett can be found on the social media links below, as can I, if you'd like to just correct me on all the things that I got wrong. Well, as mentioned, you can find all the information for all that stuff below. You can like the video, comment with feedback, suggestions, anything like that. Subscribe for more content like this, and as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers.